Okay, great. Thank you so much. We'll go ahead and get started. A moment here. I now call to order this work session of the Anchorage Assembly regarding AIM 37-2022, summary of changes to 2022 budget to conform to the executive organization. It is Friday, April 1, 2022. We are noticed from 11 a.m. until noon. Ms. Camacho, would you call the roll, please?
Ms. Allard? Mr. Constant?
Here.
Mr. Dunbar?
Here, sorry.
Ms. Kennedy? Ms. LaFrance?
Here.
Mr. Presberdia?
Here.
Mr. Peterson? Ms. Quinn Davidson? Mr. Rivera?
Present.
Thank you. Mr. Weddleton? And Ms. Zalatel?
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Camacho. I also want to note that from the administration, we have Cheryl Frasca, OMB Director, and also Marilyn Bonzoff with OMB. Is there anyone else from the administration here?
This is Blair Christensen. I'm also on.
Thank you, Ms. Christensen.
Madam Chair, this is Travis Frisk, the CFO.
Thank you, Mr. Frisk. Appreciate you all joining us for this work session today. We also have Bill Falsey, outside Assembly Counsel, available as well. Just a quick note on scheduling. Room 155 is being used for the election, and so it was unavailable for this work session. Later today, for the 1 p.m. and 2 p.m. work sessions, we will be meeting in the mayor's conference room, as we were able to work with the administration and get that scheduled for those sessions. So thanks everybody for your flexibility. The document for this work session, AIM 37-2022, is available online. If you go to muni.org, click on Assembly, and at the top, click on Assembly Work Sessions and scroll to the April 1 work sessions. And while the AIM itself is just 2 pages, there are over 70 pages of accompanying documents. This item was pulled from the consent agenda for the March 15 regular assembly meeting and was postponed to the meeting of April 12 to allow time for discussion in a work session. So we will start now by turning to Ms. Camacho, Assembly Budget Analyst, with an overview of AIM 37-2022.
Thank you. So Desiree Camacho, Assembly Budget Analyst. I'm going to give a super brief overview of the AIM, which is our summary of changes to AO 2021-96 as amended, which is our 22 general government operating budget to conform to the executive organization that was adopted in AO 2021-114 as amended. The AM, like Ms. LaFrance said, is 2 pages. It's really short and details the organizational changes in AO 2021-114 and how the budget was then conformed to those changes appropriately. It also mentions that the Assembly recognizes that the 22 approved general government operating budget is the budget that gives effect to all of the Assembly's actions, including veto overrides and some of those which are not implemented. And you can find further details in all of the attachments to the AIM. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Camacho. I want to note for the record that at 11:03, we were joined by Ms. Allard and Mr. Weddleton. So I'll go ahead and turn to Ms. Zalatel to get us started, as Ms. Zalatel requested the work session. Ms. Zalatel? Oh, and let me just note too, at 11:04, we were joined by Ms. Kennedy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I pulled this item because there was some language in the AIM that said there were no real world consequences to the implementation of the reorganization and which budget was ultimately loaded by the administration. That is something that hasn't borne out, at least in the information I've received via email. And so I wanted to explore that in particular. And I think this has come up on the floor a few times, but I thought a work session was maybe a better time to jump in and dig into this conversation around fund certifications and what funds are being put out into the community, particularly in grant programs. So, for example, I received email from those who are on the Arts Advisory Commission with information that only a portion of the mayor's community grants are it is available or going to be made available, although I believe the Assembly restored that funding and that it was restored after the vetoes were overridden. So for me, I need a better understanding of where we're at in this moment in terms of what funds are considered available in the budget. Are they only those that the administration believes it can certify, or are they all funds that the Assembly approved in the 2022 budget? And what does, so that I can get a clear understanding before we move into first quarter budget revisions, before we add layers of complexity as to fund balance and other needs. I really want to get a firmer grounding on this issue. And I believe we've been trying to, we just haven't set aside the time to have just this conversation. So I don't know who can kind of provide the information about what's actually in the budget as of today that is available for departments to charge against, that fund the grants that need to go out on the street, particularly for programs like under the alcohol tax, like the mayor's community grant program, because by the time we hit first quarter budget revisions and then the time it takes to get money out into the community, we'll have lost over a quarter of the opportunity for those funds to have been making an impact. So with that, I think there's a couple of questions in there. I can try to restate them more succinctly, but wanted to really provide an overview of where I was coming from when I pulled the item. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Zalatel. Mr. Frisk or Ms. Frasca or Ms. Bonzoff, would you like to respond?
So this is Cheryl. Travis, did you want to speak to the certification issue?
Well, as far as the certification issues are concerned, there was one specific certification of projected revenue that I could not get my arms around, and that is the need to have the bed tax. The request that was being presented would have required a $7.5 million increase in bed tax estimations over what we were already putting into our budget. And yes, I understand that our budget numbers were conservative in comparison to what happened in 2021, but it's our job to be conservative and not over speculate what we think. The number that was being presented during the budget process and everything would have equated to one of the highest, if not the highest, bed tax collection in the history of the municipality. And working with Dan Moore and myself and going through the numbers and everything, we just could not get our arms around a $7.5 million increase to net out $2.5 million worth of programs. So that is why we were specifically, we couldn't certify that. We just can't do it. Now, as far as alcohol tax, there was a question on alcohol tax. And when we originally put our budget numbers together, we didn't have a lot of data to support because it was such a new revenue stream. But having reviewed it, we concurred that specific increase in revenue from that specific stream was acceptable. So as far as fund certification, there's only one piece of this that we could not, and I could not fund cert, which is the bed tax increase required to get a $2.5 million net to the municipality.
Thank you, Mr. Frisk. There are two members in the queue with questions. First, Ms. Zalatel, queue on the bed tax projection, and then Mr. Dunbar. Ms. Zalatel?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate that clarification from the CFO. I want to bring this back then to the conversation we had when we addressed the veto overrides. And I am really uncomfortable that we ended up in a position, I think, as of today, that we just agreed to disagree, and the bed tax as a projection as approved by the Assembly for the budget in 2022 was just, we're back to this certification question. And that makes me really nervous, because I think we were really clear on the Assembly's position about that. And so I guess my question is that why we are working off of earlier the administration's projections versus the past budget? And if so, what does that mean for those programs that are funded by bed tax?
Mr. Frisk?
Through the chair, thank you for the question, Ms. Assemblyman Zalatel. I'm going to defer to Blair Christensen at this point with legal.
Through the chair, Ms. Zalatel, I'm ultimately going to defer to Cheryl Frasca, but what I would say is that, first of all, I think there's a fundamental factual issue here. So I don't think the difference was between our original numbers and the Assembly's numbers. So I think OMB can address that. But when we say there's no practical implications, it's because when we had a prior meeting, we discussed this idea that because it was all going to be trued up in first quarter budget revisions, and theoretically that difference in funding wouldn't cause any interruption in services till the end of the year, right when funds start to run out. It had no practical implications. But I think that OMB Director Cheryl Frasca can potentially, or Marilyn could potentially provide some more insight on this specific issue.
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Blair. Madam Chair, this is Cheryl Frasca, OMB. Okay, I'd first like to speak to the issue on the room tax. And again, the good news is I didn't have to go through this process. I wasn't here then, but I lived through Maryland trying to reconcile it. So I'll speak to it. Maryland can augment what I failed to say. But the Assembly approved 2.5 million in additional revenues of room tax. And first, let me back up a little bit more. The administration, we work closely and rely on the work of the Treasury Division. And we really steer away from individually saying, well, I think revenues will be higher. And so we really try to respect the work that the Treasury shop does. Because candidly, when I served in a prior administration, we came in and there had never been a true reconciliation of the revenues. And they just continued overly inflated revenues from one year to the next because they didn't want to make hard spending choices. So there was a concerted effort made then and started then to rely on the work that Treasury does. As it relates to the Assembly amendment for the 2.5 million in additional room taxes that your forecasts showed, the challenge is that bed tax revenues, as you know, are split about 3 ways. And so if you're increasing 2.5 million, you divide that by 3, and that's the amount available to general government to support our programs. But you appropriated far more of that 2.5 million than was available for general fund supported programs. So that was one of the underlying complications that related to the room tax revenues. There was also, you estimated an additional $100,000 that you thought would come from the MOA trust fund. And again, our position, the administration's position, was to rely on Treasury's work in forecasting the revenues from the MOA trust. And as is customarily done, revenues are updated as part of the first quarter budget process. So I hope that gives you some insight into some of the reconciliation that we tried to do based on the way the amendment was structured. And candidly, it also was a difficult amendment to sort out because you grouped things, you grouped appropriations and you grouped the revenue sources. It wasn't that one line of spending had a fund source that supported it. So it left us to try to sift through how much of the unrealized room taxes, what appropriation was it supporting or not available to support. So it was very difficult for us to sift through, and thank you to Desiree as she tried to work with us in sorting it out. We really appreciated her help, but it was an extremely difficult process to sift through based on how this amendments were structured and also using sources of revenue that the administration wasn't ready to realize. So I hope that helped answer your question, Ms. Zalatel.
Thank you, Ms. Frasca. Ms. Zalatel, do you have any follow-up?
Not right now. I'll pop back in the queue probably in a few minutes. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Zalatel. Mr. Dunbar?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'll say I have a comment and then a question. I don't want the question to be seen as an acceptance of the administration's position when it comes to fund certification. I think they have fundamentally misread the charter and the code as Mr. Falsey laid out in our budget veto override work session. This is not the role that that OMB or the administration has. They are to enact the budget as the assembly approves, and after we, by supermajority, overrode the mayor. And so, I mean, he can speak to it again if he wants to, but Mr. Falsey, I mean, but I think that I think we will continue to hash that out in the coming months, because again, I think the administration just fundamentally misunderstands what it means to certify a budget in this way when everything that's in a budget is a projection and none of the money when we pass it from 2022 were in hand. Specifically on the bed tax, we did understand the three-part split. We did understand the math we were using. And I'll say, and this is where I get to my question to Mr. Frisk, we had a meeting with so, you know, the administration's projections of the bed tax were very conservative, nowhere near what we were seeing in 2021. They were more similar to 2020. And so we had a meeting with Visit Anchorage just a few weeks ago, and they told us they're expecting one of the busiest summers in history, something rivaling 2019, which was the busiest visitor summer in history. And so I guess my question to you is, have you spoken with Visit Anchorage? Have you spoken with people in the visitor industry when you're doing this projection now, if you're going to be updating it, given that right now everything is booked solid all summer long? So I guess my question is for Mr. Frisk or for Treasury. Have you spoken with or worked with people in the industry since, in the past couple of months when you're doing these projections of the bed tax?
Through the chair, Assemblymember Dunbar, at this point in time, I'm still working with Treasury as far as adjustments to our forecasts for bed tax. And we're not at a position right now to discuss where we may end up on that. We do take input from obviously other sources, and we also look at history as well as current trends we're seeing as far as taxes, bed tax received in the first couple months of 2022. These are all input into our final numbers, and that we go to OMB with as far as adjustments that need to be made.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Thank you, Mr. Frisk. Mr. Constant?
Thanks. So all of this is still kind of an open area we need to figure out. When it became really clear to me was last week when we had a funding proposal put before us that had fund certified available for an administration priority where we had already appropriated those funds in the budget, but we're told, no, you can't do that. The CFO won't certify those funds available. Which, you know, comes to something that was said by one of the previous speakers that, quote, the administration wasn't ready to realize those revenues. Which gets us to the point of the question that we are challenged with. Whose authority is it to appropriate and set budgets? And so that is kind of the bigger picture question outside of the scope of this AIM, but it's certainly on my mind after seeing that document last week. So, but I do have some specific questions. Legalities aside, are there any real world differences right now between what the Assembly approved and what the administration is willing to suggest has been certifiable or certified? Like, are we pushing out smaller amounts of grants like we've heard from members of the community that these grants aren't being funded, or are we funding them? And then finally, what are our best current bed tax estimates since you're not quite ready to make the definitive statement, CFO Frisk? So that's kind of a handful of questions, but.
Through the chair, Mr. Dunbar, sorry, I apologize, Mr. Constant. Before I answer the question, can I ask you a question? You referenced a document that I wouldn't fund cert last week.
No, that you did fund cert last week. We authorized expenditures in our budget that utilized alcohol tax revenues, and we were told those could not be fund certified. And so, but last week there was an effort to appropriate a chunk of funds from the alcohol tax from last year, 2021, that we had attempted to authorize for this year, but we're told no, to pay for the FEMA reimbursement, potentially the mass care expenses, 7 million. And so that the idea there is they were available for when the administration was ready to realize them, but they weren't there when the Assembly was. So I'm just trying to grapple with that, but I don't think we're going to answer that here. I think I was just putting that on the record as so folks know that there's an open question. I think this AM deals with kind of some specific changes, and the questions that I'm more concerned about right now are related to, are there any real world differences between what we proposed and what has been certified? And then if so, or what are they? Like, are we doing fewer grants? What are the changes that are happening right now? And then what are the current best estimates for the bed tax, since you're not quite ready to give us a firm number?
Thank you for clarifying that. I wasn't quite sure what you were referencing. I thought I heard you say that I didn't fund certify, but I get where you're going with that. And to that point, let me start by saying I don't actually issue the grants. Okay, so that's not in my purview. I'll have to defer to the administration on how the grants are doled out and decided upon. That's not my job. So I have to defer on that question. I hope you understand. Yep. And at this point, I can't give you a number. We gave you a number of, I think, $24.1 million, and we have gone back and forth, Dan Moore and I, the treasurer and I, over since November of this 2021 about what we're going to raise that up to. And it is going to get increased. I just can't give you a number right at this particular moment. You know, I understand what we're hearing from the market and everything. I get that. And it's just that, again, my job is to be conservative. It's not to be overly optimistic. So I would hold that. I don't have a number for you yet, Mr. Constant. I apologize, but I want to get some additional data in. we are expecting additional data in from February bed tax numbers here in the next day or two, and that will go in to our discussion. I can tell you that some real world aspects have changed. We are seeing a market now that is literally downsliding on a daily basis for a number of reasons, including inflation, obviously the war in Ukraine and Russia transgression is impacting these markets, global markets. So right now we're going to be forecasting a lower amount of earnings from the municipal trust, the MOA trust, than we originally projected based on where we see the market going. So there are things that are changing. They're changing our projections, and we will be putting those through in the first quarter budget process.
So last question there, just a quick follow-up. Are we on track for April for our first quarter budget revision process? And yeah, are we on track for the timeline? If not, where are we at?
I will defer to Cheryl and Marilyn on that.
Thank you, Travis. Mr. Constant, yes, we are on track. We will have it to the assembly next Friday, our package.
Wonderful. Thank you, Cheryl, so much.
Okay, and if I could clarify what you were asking about in terms of the use of 2021 alcohol tax proceeds.
Right.
That went unspent. We had proposed that those monies be used for the mass care last 3 months. And in speaking with some of your colleagues, it was S version was put forward to change that to an area-wide 101 funds. So it wasn't an issue of fund certification at all. So it was just a philosophical difference.
Oh, no, Cheryl, actually in the process of our budget, when we approved it last winter, I could be mistaken, but I'm about 99% sure we appropriated the difference of the alcohol tax funds into grant programs and other processes. And we were told we cannot certify that those funds are there, so they aren't available. So we aren't going to make those changes to the budget. And we'll talk about this at first quarter. And so then at somebody's convenience, and again, I'm not pointing at a motive here, I'm just paying attention to how things are working. The funds were available for certification for a priority that wasn't what was in the budget prior, that had been adopted or amended by the assembly.
Yeah. Madam Chair, I thank you, Mr. Constant, for clarifying. And in the AM support for the alcohol tax, the whole line by line explanation, there was almost $405,000 short in terms of the projected alcohol tax proceeds, which is different than, it was a matter of timing, which was different than the amount that was being proposed to be spent for based on 22 forecasted purposes. So this issue will be back to you as part of our first quarter process.
Right. And
okay.
that I appreciate very much.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Thank you, Ms. Frasca. Next in the queue is Mr. Weddleton and then Ms. Zalatel. Mr. Weddleton?
Yeah, thanks. Couple questions. I'm going to go back a little bit. I think it seems like we strayed from the tight purpose of this work session, but this discussion is maybe more interesting. But Cheryl, you had said that when you were involved previously, that some administrations had assumed higher revenues because they were uncomfortable, it was too hard to cut or something. So, but ultimately we have to be balanced. So what did they do? What happened when revenue expectations were significantly higher than what came about? Then what?
Through the chair, Mr. Weddleton. Well, what we did in that administration is we had a briefing by Treasury in terms of the status, is doing our due diligence in mid-year, and realized based on Treasury's estimates, the substantial lack of funding that would expected. And so we had to make, I think it was about $8 million in reductions, spending reductions for July through December. So that was the response that we had to take in order to be realistic about expected revenues to support the level of spending. So that was how we had to respond to that. And then we, going forward, continue to use Treasury's recommendations for revenues. And that was, in fact, one of the first things I asked the OMB staff when I came in was if Treasury's revenues were still what was guiding budget decisions. And I was told yes, and I was really pleased to hear that because that was so important.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, we ran into that a few years ago where revenues were clearly coming in short and everybody had to cut even more. So I just, thanks. Can I ask one more, or do you want to roll around the queue?
No, go ahead, Mr. Weddleton.
Okay, so, one thing I guess this is not real clear on, there is the category under the mayor's office, for mayor's community grants. And kind of my assumption is that, okay, here's a dollar amount and he gets to spend it as he chooses. And maybe that's not quite right. I think we added some things back in it, probably with the expectation now that he has to do that. But is that correct? I mean, otherwise, why are they under kind of the mayor's department? It seems like, my assumption is they were discretionary for the mayor. So whoever is there, are they or are they not?
Are they there?
Through the chair, this is Blair Christensen. Certainly, I think that's a legal question, right? And certainly, the administration has some authority to spend funds or not spend funds. I would assume that Mr. Falsey is sitting there on the other end of the line contemplating this question as well, because I think that there's spending, there's the black and white of spending all the funds or none of the funds, and certainly the law allows for something in the gray in between. What that is, I think, is speculative, but certainly the mayor has some discretion to either spend funds or not spend funds.
Okay, so no real answer there.
Helpful,
I can understand that. So my confusion is shared. Then at least I feel good on that. Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, there's just something to think about. My assumption it was discretionary, but that's just based on only me. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. Ms. Zalatel?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I want to circle back to the information or the comments made by the CFO just around, concerns about the market volatility, and just provide how, as a member of the legislative branch, I take in that information, because I don't think we've had this conversation. I think there's some presumptions about maybe what we should do with it and how we evaluate that information. And so for my part, I take in what you're telling me. I take in what the administration provides. I take in the projections. I also take in the information from other sources, whether that's Visit Anchorage, AEDC, wherever. We are deeply ingrained in the community. It's part of our job to get all these varying perspectives. And then I make a decision. And I guess that's what I'm really struggling with in this instance, that we're here having a budget that we approved, having me at least gone through that very deliberative process, having vetted lots of information, and now we're being told that you couldn't necessarily certify the funds, and still stuck there, frankly, at the fund certification issue, because it feels like, and while I am a lawyer, I am not a lawyer in this area and not an expert in this area, that it's a violation of the separation of powers and the duties we have respective to the budget. And the reason I think we really need to have this conversation and understand how each of us work in this process is we're going to be doing it year over year. And I hope we're not here next year. And I'm still failing to see how there just aren't real world consequences, particularly where we have grant programs that are administered and otherwise. I hear what you're saying, that, yeah, it wouldn't be, those consequences wouldn't emerge until later in the year. However, I think the real world consequence is that our budget isn't the one being followed. The assembly approved budget isn't the one being followed. So, you know, when this item comes back before us, I mean, it's something to accept, and I appreciate all the work that's happened, but I'm really struggling to say that this is okay, that this process, that this happened is okay, and that we can just shore it up in first quarter, because it seems to be now making first quarter budget revisions way more complicated than they needed to be. So I wanted to share that. I'm still stuck where I was when I requested the work session. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Zalatel. Mr. Frisk or Ms. Fresca, would you like to add anything or respond to Ms. Zalatel's comments?
I'll proceed. This is Cheryl. Ms. Zalatel, I appreciate your perspective. I really do. And it didn't complicate us preparing the budget amendments. And we prepared documents that highlight, or you can track the change in these columns. So we tried to clearly identify the changes that ultimately led to the budget that the administration did approve. And there was a couple of meetings ago, speaking back to what the CFO spoke to in terms of the revenues, the Treasury Department did submit an AIM speaking to the MOA trust projections being $2.1 million less than what the 2022 approved budget was based on. So that certainly, when he makes up that kind of a report, that would be an excellent opportunity for you to engage. And you may have. I apologize if I am unaware of the engagement that you had, but that would have been an excellent time to talk with the treasurer about the basis for that kind of a change in revenue forecast, because that's substantial to an impact to what we're doing with first quarter budget revisions. And if I recall, I believe Mr. Weddleton did pull it from the agenda, but I realized I didn't stick around to hear what he had to say. So look forward to these discussions after we roll out our first quarter budget.
Thank you, Ms. Frasca. Do members have any other questions? I don't see anyone else in the queue, but I'll pause to give folks time if they're having difficulty. I do want to note actually that this item, AIM 37-2022, was pulled from the March 1 agenda. I had said March 15 agenda. It was actually March 1. It will be back before us on the meeting of April 12. I also want to note that we will have our first work session on first quarter budget revisions on Friday, April 15th, 1 to 3 p.m. in room 155. So I'll do a last call for any comments or questions. Okay, I don't see anyone in the queue. Thank you all for joining us. Mr. Frisk, Ms. Frasca, Ms. Bonzoff, thank you for being here today. And to the rest of you, hopefully I will see you at 1 p.m. in the mayor's conference room for our next work session. We are adjourned.
Thank you.